Gregg Smart came home thinking his life was still ahead of him. He was 24, newly married, and young enough to believe the future was still open. He was wrong. Someone had already turned that future into a plan. Inside his condominium in Derry, New Hampshire, an ordinary night was waiting like a trap. By the time police arrived, Gregg would be dead. And the first version of the story would look simple enough to believe. A robbery. A home invasion. A young husband killed by strangers who vanished into the dark. Furniture appeared disturbed. Personal items seemed to be missing. The scene pointed away from the people closest to him, which is exactly why it looked believable. Soon, Pamela Smart would stand before police as the grieving wife left behind, calm enough to answer, close enough to be trusted. She was 22, polished, ambitious, and working as a media coordinator at a high school. To television, she became almost too perfect, the attractive school employee, the teenage student, and the dead husband. But the real horror of this case was not the scandal, and not the headlines that later swallowed it. It was the slow collapse of every boundary that should have protected a life. Pamela and Gregg had been married for less than a year. From the outside, they looked like young adults trying to build something stable. But according to prosecutors, Pamela wanted something else: freedom, control, and a way out. The person pulled into that desire was William Flynn, known as Billy Flynn. He was not a man with equal power. He was a 15-year-old student. Pamela was the adult. Billy was the teenager. That difference matters. Because this was not just forbidden romance. It was authority, attention, fantasy, and power moving in the wrong direction. Billy was young enough to confuse obsession with love. Pamela was old enough to understand what that confusion could do. Their sexual relationship became the center of the case, but it was only the beginning. Pamela later admitted the relationship, but denied ordering Gregg's murder. Prosecutors told the jury Billy was not simply a jealous teenager acting alone. They said he had been shaped, pressured, and drawn toward violence. In their version, Pamela did not need to hold the gun. She only needed someone desperate enough to hold it for her. According to trial testimony, Pamela wanted Gregg dead because divorce was not enough. Billy, desperate for her attention, believed killing Gregg was the way they could be together. Other teenagers were pulled in: Patrick Randall, Vance Lattime, and Raymond Fowler. A school scandal was becoming a murder conspiracy. That is what makes the case so disturbing: youth corrupted around an adult's desire. First a secret, then a fantasy, then a conversation, then a plan. On May 1st, 1990, the plan moved from words to blood. Billy Flynn and Patrick Randall entered Gregg Smart's home. Gregg was confronted, forced to his knees, and shot. The scene was then arranged to look like a burglary. For a moment, the disguise worked. Pamela appeared to be the devastated wife in a random act of violence. But conspiracies depend on every frightened person keeping the same secret forever. The first cracks came quickly, because panic has a way of making people talk. A father found a .38 caliber pistol and brought it to police. Then investigators learned that Cecilia Pierce might know more than anyone expected. Cecilia had been close to Pamela. She had trusted her. Now, things Pamela had said suddenly mattered to police. Investigators asked Cecilia to wear a wire. From that moment, the case became less about blood at the scene and more about words after the murder. On the recordings, Pamela did not sound only like a grieving widow. She sounded afraid that the story was slipping away from her control. The tapes became a key part of the prosecution's case, because they let the jury hear fear, control, and pressure in real time. And the question became impossible to ignore: who is more responsible, the shooter, or the person accused of building the moment? By August 1990, police believed the circle had closed. Pamela was approached outside the school where she worked. A detective told her there was good news and bad news. The good news: they had solved her husband's murder. The bad news: she was under arrest. If you like true crime where the most dangerous person is not always holding the weapon, hit like and subscribe to Listen in the Dark. Pamela Smart's trial began in 1991, and America could not look away. It became one of the first trials to feel made for television. The courtroom became a stage, and Pamela became an image the public wanted to decode. Cold manipulator, trapped young wife, media villain, or all of those things at once. The prosecution said she used attention, intimacy, and fantasy to make a teenage boy do the unthinkable. The defense said she was guilty of a terrible affair, but not guilty of murder. Billy Flynn testified against her. Other teenagers connected to the plan testified too. To the jury, the tapes mattered. The teenage testimony mattered. The cover story mattered. But beneath the scandal, one person kept disappearing from the story: Gregg Smart himself. The public remembered the teacher, the student, the trial, and the spectacle. But Gregg was not a plot twist. He was a man killed inside his own home. In March 1991, Pamela Smart was convicted as an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Then came the twist that still makes people argue decades later. Billy Flynn, the teenager who fired the fatal shot, was later granted parole. Other teenage accomplices also eventually left prison. Pamela did not. That contrast became the second story. How should justice weigh manipulation against the act itself? Tell me in the comments, if the shooter walks free, but the person convicted of planning it never does, is that justice? For decades, Pamela said she did not order the murder. She appealed, requested sentence reductions, and became a symbol people fought over. To some, she represented the coldest violence, convincing someone else to destroy a life. To others, she represented a defendant turned into a national villain before the image could ever fade. But the center of the case remained brutal. Gregg was killed. Teenagers were involved. Pamela was convicted. In 2024, Pamela publicly accepted full responsibility for Gregg's death for the first time. But responsibility after decades could not bring Gregg back. And many still wondered, was it remorse, strategy, or both? In 2025, her request for a sentence reduction hearing was rejected, leaving the sentence exactly where it had been for decades. So the story stayed frozen: Pamela behind bars, the teenage accomplices free, Gregg forever absent. The trial became history. The movies became pop culture. The headlines became true crime memory. But the wound stayed real. Pamela kept telling her story. Billy eventually walked free. The public kept arguing. But Gregg Smart never got to explain his side. He stayed 24 forever. And maybe that is why the case still works like a trap. You enter for the scandal, but leave thinking about power, responsibility, and justice. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe to Listen in the Dark, and tell me which true crime case still makes you question everything.